everybody. Welcome back to Unity plus the X-Place Summer Game Jam series of events. It's great to have you here. I'm Alice with the X-Place, and we'll get to the panelists in just a moment. So today you're here about crafting worlds, and you're going to be hearing lively discussion among this panelist of narrative and creative designers, and really you'll get some insider views, but also some great tips and great practices. Just learn more about the field in general. So glad you're here for this. Our moderator today, we're just so delighted to have her, is Andrea Saravia Pérez, and she is a narrative designer and producer. She is a co-founder of Small Loan Studio, and that's an independent game accelerator. Andrea has a passion for storytelling. She has a very diverse skill set, and in true indie fashion, she has taken on all kinds of roles within a studio. So she's a perfect moderator for today's session. And Andrea, I turn it over to you.
Hi, thank you so much. Really happy to be here. Just kind of like with just our panelists. I thought Alice was gonna do the introduction for the rest. I'm sorry.
I can do that if you would like me
Yes.
to. Sure.
Yeah, because I have a different document up. My bad.
Okay, not a problem. Okay, so with us is Emily Grace Buck, and she is definitely a renowned narrative designer, and she has credits on over a dozen video games. She is currently studio narrative director at EA Dice, where she leads the narrative for the next Battlefield project. It's very exciting. Emily's got a diverse background, which includes roles at Ubisoft, Reflections, Gato Studio, Echo, and Lucid Games. Her credits include The Walking Dead, the final season, Batman, The Enemy Within, and Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy, all names you probably know. So welcome, Emily, to the panel today.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye.
Yes. Then next up we have Neel, and Neel, I apologize, Upadhye. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Upadhye, yeah, very close.
Okay,
Well done.
thank you. Yes. So Neel spent 14 years at EA, and while he was there, he was a director on the narrative team of Battlefield 2042, just a small little game. Served as a lead writer on Need for Speed Unbound. He created the series Stories from the Outlands for the billion-dollar gaming franchise Apex Legends, and had the joy of directing multiple internet-breaking shorts. Most recently, he led a studio of over 50 in the production of an original ARPG at Azra Games as VP of Creative Development. So, Neel, welcome. I suspect that so far we've got a great lineup here of great details that are going to be shared with us. We're really glad to have you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yes. And then next up we have Kevin Leung. Am I pronouncing that correctly, Kevin? You gave me a little coaching.
Yep.
Okay.
Perfect. Yeah.
So Kevin has always wanted to make video games, and we've been delighted during this Summer Game Jam to have Kevin pop in and out of different sessions and get to know him a bit. He graduated from the University of Waterloo with a degree in mathematics and cognitive psychology, and he has over 20 years of work experience with many different roles in the disciplines of level, game, and narrative design. He has several AAA titles from his gameography, including Metal Gear Solid, The Twin Snakes, Rainbow Six Vegas, and the latest coming soon, entitled Unknown 9 Awakening. His first endeavor as a bona fide storyteller and scriptwriter was Catan Stories, Legend of the Sea Robbers. So welcome, Kevin. It's so wonderful to have you here today.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Andrea.
And last but by no means least is Dori Arazi. He's an award-winning cinematic director with a passion for visual storytelling. Working with talent on set, he combines a keen eye to foster strong performance with evocative imagery and creative shot designs. Dori is a virtual production creative and technical trailblazer, designing custom equipment and pipelines. So that combined with a deep and intuitive grasp of an array of cinematic languages, Dori sets all kinds of new quality bars from preface to content finalization. In Dori's background in animation, VFX, and game development, he brings forward a great cross-disciplinary vision throughout production. He has done award-winning work on God of War, and he has also built and directed cinematic teams for Sony, EA, Midway Games. Welcome, Dori. We are so glad to have you here.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yes. Andrea, with that, I think your panel is introduced and you can take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I know that we just had like a bit of like the introductions, but I kind of wanted to explore that a little bit. We have a lot of people that really want to get into like games nowadays. So I was wondering if we could hear like the way that the Zoom call is structured. I have Kevin first and then Emily, Dori, and Neel. Would you mind sharing how you got your first studio job and how that journey was for you?
You want me to take it away?
Yep, please.
So my journey is a little bit unconventional. Back in the mid 90s, late 90s, it was fairly easy to get into a job because, you know, there were no game design schools, there were no narrative design schools. Having said that, I always knew that I wanted to get into games, so I studied in cognitive science. And that's just the science of how people solve problems. So the way I got my job was really through the psychology department when there was this game studio in Ontario. Maybe some of you have heard it. It's called Silicon Knights. They were going around asking for new game designers, and they were trying to take a different approach. So we knew that there were no schools for this stuff. So it was like, can we get people who study in problem solving? Because as we all know, video games are all problem solving. And I met the president of the studio at Silicon Knights. His name is Dennis Dyack. And I just bugged them repeatedly for like what seems like 3-4 months, get into a job. And finally they relented and they were like, okay, Kevin, come on board. So that was me. That's my story.
Oh, that's awesome. I have noticed like a bit of like people trying to like pivot from like different industries where like, you know, they would have degrees in anthropology and, you know, cognitive sciences as a new one. But I do think that perhaps like there's hope for people with like non-game degrees to still break in.
Definitely. Yeah. I never think it's too late to transition. So
And no, that's a good point. And I'm trying to move a little bit fast just in the interest of time. So I do apologize if it seems like I'm rushing, by the way. But Emily, your name's kind of like on the lineup in my feed. And I was wondering if you mind sharing your journey with us.
Sure. So I'm another person who has an unconventional entry into games, but I think kind of like what Kevin was mentioning, up until probably about a decade ago, there really weren't game degrees in university. So most people you'll speak to who are in kind of their mid-30s and older who work in games are usually going to start out with that as their beginning to their game dev story, which I think is really interesting. It isn't necessarily as relevant to people today, but especially for people trying to transition in from other things, hopefully that can be slightly useful. So I actually, I started working in entertainment when I was a teenager. I was like a child actor working in some local TV and theater and that type of thing. And then I went to university for acting. I went and got a BFA in drama at NYU and studied at RADA a bit, thinking I really wanted to be an actor, but about 3 years into that degree, realized I did not want to be an actor, and I didn't actually like being on stage in front of people or being the one doing the recording. I wanted to write the stuff, and what I really liked was interactive theater. And then I started to realize interactive theater and video games had an awful lot in common. Started thinking about wanting to break into working in games, had absolutely no idea how to do it. I became a drama teacher in the New York City public school system and was actually going back to get my master's in education at Brooklyn College, and decided to focus my thesis on educational games. And I didn't end up finishing my master's degree because I got hired by an educational game company called Cognito as a junior instructional designer, and then eventually focused in on narrative design from there.
That's crazy because I'm actually doing an instructional design degree right now, a master's. What a small world. And I am wondering just kind of like, I'm wondering like, what are some soft skills from your background in acting that perhaps you use like in your day-to-day, since I've heard like that really helps with like script writing, for example.
Would say it's not even just soft skills. I work with actors a whole lot, obviously, in my current job as a narrative director. We're constantly casting actors, writing dialogue for actors, trying to help actors ad lib, things like that. I think it's a pretty direct line of skills from one to the other, but also just learning things like improvisation early on in my career really set me up to be able to think about multiple possibilities in game dev spaces and things like nonlinear storytelling.
Yeah, that's very useful. I didn't think about like how like the connection between like nonlinear and like an acting background. I think we're still kind of like in like the acting cinematic space also, Dory. Would you mind like sharing just kind of like your journey with us?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I can, echo Kevin and Emily's stories as well. I came in sideways. I loved movies, loved films, loved storytelling. And, back again, late 90s, early 2000s, there wasn't really a clean path. So I did a degree in animation and visual effects. Started in the film industry doing visual effects work for some Hollywood productions. Wasn't really what I was looking for. And I was always a gamer, always loved games. I mean, I remember the cinematics and the first Diablo Blizzard trailers, like, oh my God, we can do these things in games. And yeah, early 2000s, I moved over to video games as a cinematic lead. And that slowly progressed into different games, different franchises, moved into narrative direction, cinematic direction, and kind of, like everybody's echoing, like working with actors, bringing in the animation side, the effects side, and figuring out how to kind of combine all that in a non-linear format.
And what was there like a specific thing that really pushed you? Like, I know that you still kind of like do cinematics and narrative work, like you do a little bit of everything all the time, but kind of like what pushed you to like expand into narrative design in addition to your background in cinematics?
Yep. So this is going to sound really highfalutin, but I think games are the next natural evolution of our storytelling medium. We had writing, then we had still photography, then we had moving films. Now we have moving narrative with player agency, which is one step away from human experience. And now the question is, how do we create the verbs and the grammar to utilize this format, which I think we're just scratching the surface of. So I find that a lot more interesting and a lot more challenging, a lot more forward thinking than doing linear media. We know how to do that. We've been doing that for 120 years. This is like a new fresh angle.
Yeah, that's I think I've heard about like that in like ProcGen like articles, but that's a really interesting take. So I'm really glad this is recorded so that I can look at that. And people take notes. I highly recommend that. But thank you so much, Dory. And Neel, so tell me just kind of like how you got to like really into like narrative design in a studio, if you don't mind me asking.
Absolutely. Well, I got my first job in games coming out of film school. So like everyone else here, film degree or game degrees were early a thing. And I studied film at USC in Los Angeles. And as I was leaving school, I had two job opportunities in front of me. One was in post-production at a post house, and I'd be dubbing tapes in the back, and it was a union gig, which meant that I wouldn't be allowed to touch an Avid or edit anything for years until, I got enough hours. And the other job was in marketing at Electronic Arts, cutting podcasts for Command and Conquer. There was a marketing podcast series called Command and Conquer TV way back in the day, and that was my first job. And I decided to do that instead of getting into film, which I'm still very passionate about, because I thought it was going to let me get better at my craft every single day and actually start cutting right away. And, a few years in, I thought, oh no, I've made a huge mistake. All my friends who just decided to get coffee for Seth MacFarlane or like an assistant writer on Family Guy. And I'm in this other weird industry, what's going on? But then over time, as we've seen, films have become only more cinematic, games have become only more cinematic. And the real inflection point was when I became a creative director on the marketing side for the Star Wars games at EA. And I've had the privilege of working in a marketing capacity and then eventually in a transmedia narrative capacity on all the Star Wars games that EA has made. So I've had a little bit of crossover with Dori. He joined Survivor just as I was leaving, and he and I also crossed paths way back in the day on Command and Conquer. So it's really fun to be here. And my delve into being purely on the developer side is fairly recent in the last 5 years or so. And so the the thing that I see is very interesting is how our narrative in games hasn't necessarily for me changed, it's just broadened. It's still perfectly acceptable to present narrative in games the same way that we did 20 years ago. And a lot of people have nostalgia for that type of thing, where you lightly set up something and the gameplay is king, and that's what's going to be front and center the entire time, to something like what Dori just worked on with Survivor, incredibly cinematic, right? And everything in between. And so to me, still having a very strong foothold in linear, and I do work in film, and right now I'm directing a commercial for a Marvel video game, and so I still work on set in that medium a lot. And for me, what's so interesting is that narrative in games is now told in a transmedia way. It's told in the game and out of the game. And I think I'm one of a few people who've has had this kind of weird career path where I've come from marketing and come from linear into games and still have a foothold in both. And so hopefully that perspective is interesting.
It is very interesting. And I definitely want to tap into just kind of like how film and problem solving has like informed just kind of like everyone's approach to narrative design. But a quick question for Neel is, we do have a lot of people in the chat, not going to say who, but who actually have a marketing background and are pivoting into games. And when I've collaborated with them, I noticed that there's a lot of skills from there that really sort of like make their way into this craft. And I'm wondering if you experienced that and if you have any particular instances that maybe you can share.
Well, I think the most important thing when you're a marketer is understanding who you're talking to. I think it's marketing. I didn't study it. I was just at EA and I was in that role, and it became, a master class in marketing, working with some really incredible people at EA over the years. And it's constantly pitching. You're pitching all the time. And unlike being a dev where you might be on one project for 4 or 5 years, within my first 10 years at EA, I don't know how many different games I'd touched, how many different teams that I'd spoken to. And because your job is to make their work look the best it can possibly look, their problems become your problems. You want to be good partners to them. You have to have empathy for all the struggles that they're going to go through as developers on this particular thing. And so I got exposure to how are they telling stories in a huge variety of genres, from racing to tactical to mobile to RPGs, shooters, games with no single player at all. And so I think that exposure, first of all, is just really good. And the constant having to pitch and know who you're talking to is really important. So if I'm in a meeting talking to a developer, what's most important to them in that call? Is the fact that someone's in there talking about their trailer actually a distraction? So how am I going to speak to them? Versus, okay, I have to pitch this to like Laura Mealy or something like that, right? So that skill I would say really hold on to, because now you just have to turn that lens to the player. And it's like, who are you really talking to? You're not making a game for everybody. You're making a game for someone who is this experience for, and how do you talk to them very specifically? I think that's really transferable. And there's a whole host of other things, but I'm a strong believer in knowing how you're going to sell something before you make it. Games are really risky, and you can de-risk that by being really clear about who you're talking to.
Yeah, also just kind of like the concise nature of like marketing language helps so much with like how we have to just kind of like develop narratives that are quick so that the player gets it. That's something that I feel like we are always struggling, just kind of like telling a story when people are skipping cinematics, which brings me to the next subject. And let's try to like do like the opposite order. So I want to talk a little bit about just kind of like world building and how do you all as like storytellers really kind of like embed like so much lore and history into these IPs, and maybe even like if you want to talk about like how world building aspects can kind of like transcend media and like like maybe campaigns that you've worked on. Dori, I'm not sure if maybe you'd like to share like a response to it, or if you know of like somebody else's like efforts that you'd like to highlight. Here's kind of like the room for it.
Yeah, of course. No, with pleasure. Just to really quick echo something Neil said and a question that was on the channel. With pivoting and changing lanes and so on and so forth. What I would personally recommend is not think that the only way to get into something is to go and get a degree in it. I find that the first year in doing something probably teaches you more than 5 years of a degree. Go online, go on YouTube, look around, see what people are doing, try it yourself, put yourself out there, get something that might not be perfect what you think you're doing, learn from there. I think that's the best way to find what it is you want to do in a career, and you might even find that what you like is not what you thought you like. So have no fear, I think is the main deal. But to world building, I think games give us opportunities in world building that, like, for instance, again, it's more difficult to do in linear media. For me, at least, it all boils down to the character experience. So at the end of the day, we need to sympathize or empathize with someone. It could be a group of someone's, could be a specific someone. But the way the world impacts this someone and why this someone is interesting to experience need to combine. So when you build the world for your narrative, you have to build it in a perspective of what does that do to make my character special? Or what does that do to make my character interesting? What does that do to make my character's conflict interesting? I'm someone who loves grounding fantasy. So all that stuff that is like ungrokkable, dragons and lore and all that kind of stuff, but make it feel like it's your next door neighbor, not like this unreachable, unattainable. So an example of world building, for instance, on God of War, the writers there did an amazing job, is you're building the world with the knowledge of a certain expectation. Gods exist and they live among us. They have superpowers, but they're just people and they have the same gripes and the same problems. Now, if I am that in that world, what kind of conflict can I put myself or find myself in? And that helps build the world in order to properly push on a character. If you look on something like the X-Men franchise, the world building is what makes that interesting. Of course, people having cool powers and claws coming out of hands, that's all fun. But the idea is some people are born with the capability to do uncontrollable harm. How do you manage that? What is the social structure around that? What is the challenge for somebody who is born with that? And what does that mean? And then on top of that, give them a cool power, right? So the fun thing in games is that world building ambience happens around you as you play the game. It doesn't have to be told at you all the time with dialogue or with a character play. The way the world is structured, what you see, what you do, and again, this goes back to the verb of games, not the verbs of story. When you push a button and it does something, what does it do and what does that mean to how you built the world? And now the character story becomes an ambient interaction in the choices you made in building the world. So I think world building in games is key. You build the right world and your character will function in it. Now your character is interesting. Now your mechanics are interesting. Now your game's gonna be awesome.
I just want to say, as somebody who has played all of the God of War games, I definitely noticed that intent really coming through with every experience. So just kind of like shout out to all the devs in that project. And I really love your angle from like just kind of like the character perspective. But Emily, I'm really curious to know sort of like how you collaborate with voice actors to really bring the world building to just live, and how that background in acting really informed like your responsibilities as director now.
Oh, that's a great question. I think just to kind of jump off of what Dori was saying too, world building ends up slightly different depending on whether you're doing an original IP or you're working in a licensed IP, or an IP with other games that have already happened in it, if it's like owned by the company that you work for. Just to kind of quickly touch on that you can start building something with some of the world already done, but then you need to look at how do we ground this for the person? Because obviously you're not a god, right? Like when you're playing God of War, you're not walking through the world with those kinds of powers. But to compliment you on the games that you've made, a lot of people are dads, and they understand what that feels like, and that's something that's relatable. And then you can make that a mechanic, and you can make that something that grounds people. And when you're working with actors, you have to find those moments of making things really realistic. You know, one of the things I think that worked the best when I was working on the Batman games at Telltale, and we had Troy Baker playing our Batman, and obviously he's a well-known voice actor, and it's for a reason. It's because he's often very good to work with and bring something creative to the table. There was actually one scene that we were working on in the second game where we reintroduced Catwoman for the first time. She wasn't in the first episode of the second game. You haven't seen her in a year. The players haven't seen her in over a year. And they were supposed to have a conversation. And we actually ended up, after trying to record it in the booth with him, having the characters do it over text messages instead, where instead of having a conversation between the two, choices popped up as if she was texting you from across a room. Here's somebody you hooked up with a year ago, haven't seen since. You're supposed to be listening to something, and she's communicating with you via text message. And that was just a really good example of an actor actually saying, like, I don't even want to be saying these lines. Maybe there's another way we could do this to kind of get that moment, because players in that game, like they're not Batman, right? They're not a superhero, probably. I mean, if some of you are superheroes, that's awesome, and I'm very excited for you. But they're probably not also billionaire, playboy, philanthropists. But they probably understand the awkward situation of seeing an ex somewhere that you're not expecting to, and figuring out how to deal with that. And it's just constantly bringing it not down, because I think especially when you're working in high fantasy settings, you do want to continue to elevate, and you want that feeling of something cool and mystical happening, or in high superhero settings. But just making sure that there's something about this character that feels human and relatable to everyone. And the more you can involve the actors in that process of bringing something back to the character, they can surprise and delight you. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've been working with really good actors and we end up rewriting something in the booth or going in a slightly different direction because they're sitting with that character 24 hours a day, whereas the writers, we're writing tons of different ones.
Yeah. And is there kind of like a limitation to like how much like an actor's input can, like, like, can they drastically change a scene, or like, is there kind of like a spectrum that they can navigate in?
Oh, it always depends on the production realities of the project and also what you want to do creatively, right? There's plenty of times where you go in and it's like, no, we need these lines exactly as written because there's a very specific gameplay need to this. Please do not improvise. And then there's other times where there is a lot of potential flexibility. It just depends on where you are with a project at the moment, how much say you as a writer or narrative director in the booth have, because obviously games are a collaborative process. Like the game I'm working on right now has like 2,000 people working on it. If I went into a booth and suddenly changed things massively, everybody would be angry at me the moment I came out. But if you're working on a small team with 5 people, maybe you do have that kind of freedom. It just depends. You have to read the room and make sure that you're collaborating with everybody on your team.
Yeah, sometimes I forget like how big studios can be, because like Fire Artist had like, I think, massive like 200 something. No, that's crazy. But thank you so much for that answer, because I've also noticed like a lot of like voice actors pivoting into like narrative. So that's super helpful for everyone out there to know like the collaborative process. But yeah, Kevin, so just going back to you, like, in franchises like, Metal Gear Solid or within like what you can share, sort of like how has your approach to world building be? And is there some like, have you explored like transmedia, just, with that problem solving background that you have?
Yeah, it's very interesting because at Reflector, where I'm working now, we bill ourselves as a transmedia company. So that means podcasts, comic books, documentary, and obviously, the game is coming out. So to Emily's point, if you're talking about an original IP versus established IP. Ours, Unknown Nine, is an original IP. And one technique I could recommend to everybody out there is to use this thing that in the craft of film writing is the audience surrogate. So I suggest a parallel, which is the video game surrogate. Because we have such an original world, we have so many concepts and terminology, pronouns that we're flinging back and forth. Why not have a character who best represents the player, who doesn't know anything yet? And they're the ones who can ask questions like, how come you can do such a power, like what is the source of your power, and all these things. And it just still feels natural, and the player learns at the same time and eases their way into the lore. And the one good example of doing this is we have two techniques. One is we can actually build a character. That means modeling the character and then finding a voice actor for him or her. The second type is really just kind of like a voice that doesn't necessarily have a face or anything like that, but shows up from time to time in text messages, in emails, even when the game is loading. We can have quotes, from a person. And the person that we constructed, this person was named Emilio. And Emilio is a university professor. He gives talks about the vast lore of Unknown Nine, and he doesn't exist anywhere in our game except for having just his name pop up to identify the quotation. But that's a very sort of cheap and fast but effective way to get across this world building.
Yeah, that's useful. And I do want to kind of like go back to the point about Emilio, just kind of like in our question, but I'd like Neil to maybe like could you give us just kind of like an insight about like your experiences kind of like in transmedia storytelling? Like, have you sort of like had to tell a story like in games and then also maybe do a marketing campaign for it? Because I'm really curious with like that background, how that has played out.
Sure. So maybe it'll just help to, define transmedia. I'm sure there's a lot of definitions, but what I think of it as is telling one story seamlessly through multiple mediums. And so that can take a lot of coordination, and you're very much a quarterback that's going to have to pass the ball a lot and let people that have their own areas of expertise and understand social storytelling versus the people who are going to be responsible for in-game execution. Perhaps that's you in a particular role versus anything that's going to be, let's say, animated short films, right? And so you can have a lot of different stakeholders, and making this clean in terms of when is information revealed, going into another medium that drops an Easter egg or fleshes it out and sets up some kind of in-game event, then pops off in the game. That game drip feeds more breadcrumbs that you can have lining up what the next seasonal trailer is. And so you can have a roadmap that basically becomes, how is the narrative going to unfold, and marketing beats actually become beats along an arc. And you're going to build that and slowly drip feed information and reveal information, have opportunities to build depth on what a different medium has set up, and vice versa. So that's generally how I think you should do it, is think about your marketing timeline or your rollout of information, let's say, to the player, almost like a arc for a story arc, and then figure out what pieces of execution are going to be taken up by everyone. And an example I'll bring up is in Battlefield 2042. And so I was responsible specifically for the transmedia storytelling on that one. There was a great team embedded at DICE. I helped them come up with the player fantasy of the NOPATs. And that was an amazing experience because we hired an international writer's room as we brought that together. And so the game had maps set all over the world. And I hired a South American writer, writer from a Netflix show in the Middle East, a Korean writer, an Indian writer, a Singaporean writer. Everywhere we had a map, and used that to help develop the history of the world, bringing it up to the point in 2042 where the war was going to take place. And so we tried to build it up from a maps first perspective. And that's because that's where the players are going to spend their time, right? And so ultimately, the way that we decided to do this in a transmedia way is we created a character that was going to be an embedded journalist, and wrote a story for that character that was going to end up taking them through and touching all these locations around the world where he's embedded with this non-patriated population because of all the mass migration that's happened as like the cli-fi situation unfolds in that world. And the breadcrumbs of all those stories were written with an interactive website, kind of like an Indiana Jones map where you click through it. But then the most impactful line, almost like a hook from each of those stories that had embedded screenshots and articles and art, was brought over to Twitter. And so then Twitter would be like, this guy's live tweeting what's happening as, we tick up through the years to 2042. And so that became a part of it, because we knew that some people will only see that. They won't necessarily click through to the website. And all of those events that were happening in Twitter and this interactive map led up to the debut of a full 10-minute short film that was, really a joy to write, and we did, I think, a great job with it. And that revealed ultimately in that film that a main character from Battlefield 4 was going to be returning in 2042 as an operator. And that set up basically the events that would pick up in the game when you booted up the Fatui. And so that map, none of that is in software until the very, very end. But we found a way to extend the storytelling, into a year before the game comes out, and drip feed it through. So that's an example of how you can do something like that.
No, I love the international approach you had to that. And I'm not sure if this will make it into the final game, but there was a game shown in like PAX Australia a while back, called Dark Web Streamer, where the Twitch integration, it's a procedurally generated narrative driven game. And so the Twitch integration can read the Twitch chat of like whoever's actually like streaming in real life. And then all of the Twitch chat becomes like canon NPCs in the game. So that is something that I definitely recommend people to check out. Just because, again, like I really love exploring like how we can tell, again, like, stories through different mediums. Now, into a segue though, like this was a little bit touched by like Kevin and Neel, but stories also have to be delivered with a bit of tact. So I'm wondering, whenever you in your career have had to tell a story, and perhaps either the characters are of a community that you're not a part of, different gender, race, creed, how do you navigate it? Have you brought on consultants? And I'm wondering, we can start with Emily, and then just kind of like make our way from there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of good ways to navigate that. Consultants are absolutely a good idea. If you don't have anybody on your team who represents the type of community that you're trying to represent in your game, you need to be asking that community and paying them to make sure that you're doing something correctly. Of course, just having a diverse team is also a really, really good idea, so that you have people who have different lenses that they can bring to your project, even if you're not trying to represent specific characters from their communities. User testing is also huge. Get things in front of users from that community, from similar communities, from other communities. I mean, working on Battlefield, sometimes on conflicting communities, to make sure that you're getting a full perspective of what you might be trying to show. Another one is, again, work with actors. If you have a character who is of a certain marginalized community or identity, if you can find an actor who has a similar experience, you can often learn a lot from them about what that character might have gone through or how to portray that character. So don't forget about the actor being able to really bring something to the table there as well. And I also, when looking to create characters and working with actors, allow the actor to bring something to the table. If you had not considered, for example, that a character could be gay and you cast a gay actor, maybe think about trying to bring that aspect of the actor's experience into the character if it fits for your story. That's just an example, but there's so many different opportunities there on how you can expand the world. One particular example that I think was really interesting, though, that I got to work with was when I worked with Gatos. That was a Spanish studio based out of Galicia, making a game about the myths and legends of Galicia. That's northwest Spain, for people who have no idea where that is. And most of the developers were from there. I'm an American who was, living there and working with them, but made sure that I spent time there and started trying to really learn the language, learn the culture, ask all of my other coworkers to make sure that what we were putting forward as a story really worked and reflected their culture in a way that they were excited about. So it's not just making sure that there's narrative people looking at things, but people in your art department, people in your cinematics department, people in your gameplay department. If you're trying to show diverse experiences, it's not just on the ownership of the narrative department to make sure that that gets done.
So that was a great response. Thank you. I'm wondering if Dori, if you could answer that, and then in the interest of time, I want to then kind of like move on to a question from the audience, if that's okay.
Sure. I mean, Emily covered absolutely most of it. In the ways to bring that in for a bottom line for me when it goes down to narrative, the most important thing is authenticity. Be true to the person, be true to the culture, be true to the community, and also be true to what your story is about. And it's nothing is more painful than portraying something in an untrue way, especially to people who might be of that specific, race, color, or creed. When it comes to boiling down the story, and I think that's what makes it tricky, both the inclusion and the impact of the story. I find it personally effective to make the story about something that is more unifying on a human level. If you look at the old Brother Grimm stories, they're all about stories of survival, right? Don't go into the woods, right? Don't lie, people won't believe you. Things that that's just being kind of colloquial, but things that bind us as human beings. And then on top of that, we can add the richness of certain perspectives.
Yeah, the universal sentiment is definitely like just so integral to the human experience, really. And I thank you for like bringing that up. There's a question from Flo in the audience that I think would really benefit like the entire community to be answered, which is, I've had great experience working with narrative designers as an art director, collaborating on world building, but also problem solving to minimize scope. I've also had the opposite experience where we don't have channels of communication with the writers and the scope becomes almost unbearable. So I'm wondering how much collaboration is there between writers, artists, and developers in AAA studios as someone who is looking to transition from mobile games to PC and console games? Neel, would you want to tackle that question first, and then I'll move to Kevin?
Well, certainly, I actually was just addressing that in the channel, but yeah, ideally there is a lot of collaboration. I was at Azure Games, which is a small indie studio with AAA ambitions, and the way that I thought about collaborating with the art directors was that as someone in charge of narrative, a lot of my job is to write things that weren't words or dialogue. It's writing the work that is going to inspire the visual storytellers, because I'm not an artist, but you work with, well, I'll just make an aside and say that learn to direct actors because those skills are highly transferable to directing any kind of creative. Speaking in that emotional language that gives actionable feedback, actionable direction to an actor is the same way that you can talk to a composer to get the best out of them because they're performing, the same way that you talk to an animator, the same way that you talk to a level designer. And so it's just something to keep in mind. If there's good books on directing actors out there, and there's several, I think that those are very transferable skills. But in general, think about yourself as a narrative designer, creating the documents that like explain why the birds are angry and circling overhead. That's not dialogue in the game, but someone needs to animate those birds, and that's going to help create a mood, help further the story, right? Things get creepier as you get closer to the obelisk. Okay, well, what does that mean? What's the history of what's happened here? As a narrative director or a director in film, your job is to answer questions. Ultimately, that's your job. And to know the moment before and the moment after every moment that someone is executing. And so that is so pivotal for the art team to know. And that same thing about economy and knowing how to do something with less. Ideas are cheap, man. Like, come up with a new idea if the scope's not there. This is a collaborative art form. And so hopefully there's syncs and there's a narrative is invited to the table with the other disciplines. If that's not the case, then just go direct and form your own back channels where you can create a one-on-one connection with the stakeholders on the other side.
Yeah, the idea is like the fact that they're cheap and they kind of like have to change according to the scope. That's a good point to highlight, especially like in heavily collaborative environments like we were mentioning. Yeah, like so Kevin, in Metal Gear, did you kind of like encounter those where like there had to be a lot of interdisciplinary talks, and how did you navigate that? Just tying it back to the question.
Sure. Yeah. So being siloed in our industry, especially in the AAA space, is a huge challenge. I think everybody knows that, and communication is paramount. I found that it's really important that everybody on the team, regardless if you are a writer, artist, level designer, game designer, etc., that we're all trying to use the same terminology in our game. So, for example, in Unknown 9, I can't have everybody saying, gloves, right? So if one of the weapons or the tools that the main character has is a glove, we can't have everybody saying that all the time, because we refer back to the documents and it's listed as the bracers. So it's really important, because once everybody, that's just an example, right? But I mean, once everyone starts using their own terminology, you have, breakdown in communication, which leads to chaos. So one technique that I would suggest is probably try to form multidisciplinary teams or pods, so that you have one artist, one game designer, one level designer, programmer, etc. Ideally in those pods, you would have somebody from the narrative team in there, and they can go around and they can seed the lore, the narrative design, and you can say things like, "Hey, by the way, our player uses bracers." Um, and the second thing I would recommend is sometime here in Montreal, Quebec, we have these things called 5 à 7, which is a French way of saying happy hour. So during the happy hour, we love to have somebody come up on stage and just give a very brief 5-minute overview on who is the villain of our piece, because not everybody knows who is the villain of our game. Describe their background, their origin, things like that, and let people have a good time, soak in some information, have a beer, and we just see that information over time.
Yeah, no, that was a good response. Just to move on to like one last question, if I may. I really appreciate your response, Kevin. Somebody was asking, like, what are some skills to highlight and applications for narrative roles when the experience is personal work? So, i.e., fan fictions, maybe campaigns. And if you all happen to have recommendations for even like tools and like, more of like something to go beyond just kind of like making more scripts to
Yeah,
maybe help
right.
out people, let me know. And Dori, I was wondering if maybe you'd like to respond to that. And yeah.
My apologies, I was actually answering something. Can you give me a synopsis of the question again?
Oh yeah, no, if there's any advice just kind of like to for people that to like kind of highlight on their applications when most of their work is personal work, like fan fictions and campaigns, like what are some skills that they can highlight, or even tools that they can learn?
Sure. I mean, that really depends on what it is you want to apply for. The narrative field, at least in the AAA side, is really, really broad. It can be from technical design to technical writing for technical design to writing for cinematics. And those are very different skill sets. So first, I'd find what it is you really want to do and do some research about what is out there for that specific discipline. Like if there's a game you played that had a really great thing of that, look into that type of let's say a driver, if it's a mechanical driver or writing for mechanical driver, or a really well organized plot for cinematics, or character play for cinematics, and just write that. I personally, when I receive either reels or resumes or writing samples that are personal work, I have no problem with that whatsoever if it's good. If it's, we put out a job description for a specific role and a very poignant resume comes in with very poignant information that's really high quality, that is personal work. It's fine. It's actually great. though the opposite is also true. If we're looking at very specific JD, let's say for a writer for technical game mechanics, and somebody comes in and gives me a narrative script for, you know, a cinematic approach, that's actually frustrating from a recruiter standpoint. So do your research, be on point. For me, the tools are mostly irrelevant. If let's say you're coming in to write for narrative systems, but you only know Unity, or you've only worked on a proprietary engine, or you're only done Unreal, it doesn't really matter. When you work in a studio, chances are you're going to be picking up some form of proprietary workflow anyway. Just show you can do the stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, definitely, like I think like learning just kind of on the fly is also like a good skill to just have like a soft one. But Emily, I saw that you were responding to somebody about how they like showing out that they can write non-linear is a huge fail. Do you mind kind of like expanding sort of like how do you want to see that in a portfolio if you were looking for like another collaborator?
Yeah. One of the things that's often missing in writing portfolios is anything that's not just a straightforward screenplay kind of script. I think a lot of people now know the advice to try and put in a twine game, and I'm seeing more of that. But even things like barks are immensely helpful to have in your portfolio, especially if you're trying to write for a AAA game. That's often a huge portion of what you'll be doing, especially if you're looking at something in the multiplayer space. You know, it's not going to be branching dialogue choices. It's not going to be the type of thing that I worked on when I was a Telltale. It's going to be this, you know, working on Battlefield. It's like this soldier could say any one of 3,000 different things, depending on what you're doing in the match. And trying to think in that way is really, really critical. So please put bark sheets in your portfolios, have them in different styles of IP. Like if you can have something military, if you can have something fantasy, so that we can see that you understand that that's what a lot of the work would be, that you can think in that way, in not just branching dialogue, but like an actual full sandbox type of experience.
That's a lovely response. Thank you so much. I really wanted to just get everybody's input on that question. So I'm really sorry in the interest of time, we will have to wrap it up. But thank you, Kevin, for highlighting RDC Draft in the chat or Backlight. You know, in the recording, please check those tools out if you can. And Alice, I believe you said you had an announcement to make.
I do. First of all, let's give either a visual or digital applause and thank our panel for just great conversation and interactivity. We'd love to have you back because there's more. I know there's more. You have so much more you have to share.